The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
In September on the programme, we spoke to Director of Manx National Heritage Edmund Southworth about the origins of the Manx Museum and National Trust, the preservation of the island's ancient monuments, and the promotion of the island's heritage. But Manx National Heritage is also responsible for preserving and managing the national collections, which cover all aspects of Manx history. On today's programme, we'll find out more about some of those collections, what they contain, and the reasons they're kept and accessed. Jude Dickin is Collections Information Manager. But just what does that role entail?
The word information sometimes confuses people. Actually, museums are all about information. If we replace the word information with stories, maybe that's an easier way to look at it. Every object we collect, whether that's a museum, archive or library book, or sites and monuments out in the landscape, every one of those has a story behind it, research that's gathered around it, how we acquired that item, who gave it us, who it was owned by, who made it. All that information that you see presented in our galleries across Manx National Heritage sites, all that information is the stuff that I manage. I don't create all that information, of course. We have a fantastic team here at Manx National Heritage, our professional services team, and which are curators and the library and archives team, who are cataloguing those collections, understanding and uncovering more information about those. And my role is really making sure that we safeguard that information, but also, more importantly, that we make that information accessible to the public.
So how do you do that? Start with safeguarding. How do you safeguard information?
Well, there's a whole profession around that. My background is actually as an archivist, so I come very much from the training of, information is king. But how we safeguard it is, obviously, we have systems, so we have a very comprehensive database. For those who want to know, it's called MIMSI-XG. It's used by a variety of museums across the world, and we use the same one. And we store the information in that database, and we're constantly adding to it and refining it. And of course, we're still collecting objects, so it's very much a live database. But we also have the more traditional deposit files, or what we term accession registers, which when an object comes in, we still do write in those accession registers. I used to work at the British Library before coming here, and would you believe it that the British Library, the manuscripts department there, also had an accession register. So we do still rely on those traditional forms as well. And of course we have the deposit files, as we call them, which records all the information about an object when it's deposited with us.
How do you make it accessible? And accessible to who? Well,
I hope all your listeners have visited iMuseum.im. And if you haven't, then make it on your list to do today. So that's iMuseum, iMuseum.im. It's freely available online. And there you can explore all our collections. So all that collections information I've been talking about, we make accessible through iMuseum, which is our collections online. We also have on there, as well as the information, you'll notice we've also digitised a lot of the items themselves. So that's a lot of our photographs, historic photographs of the Isle of Man, but also objects as well in our collections, and also our artworks. So all of our oil painting collection, for example, you can view online on iMuseum, including those that we don't currently have on display. So obviously we can't display, as is true of all museums, we can't display every item that we have in our stores, but we can make it, and we do make those accessible through iMuseum. If you also want to come and see the real thing and explore our collections more, then you can. And you can do that through our library and archives, which the reading room is open at the Manx Museum from Wednesday to Saturday, 10 a.m. till 5 p.m. No need to book. It's free. So just turn up and you can ask our wonderful team what it is you're interested in, and they can help you discover our collections in that way. But also in terms of our museum collections, if there's an artwork you want to see or an archaeological excavation item you want to look at, then again you can get in touch with us at Manx National Heritage. Just go to our website or call in to the museum and you can make an appointment to come and see that work. For museum collections it is by appointment, because obviously we have to make sure that the item is okay to be produced and that we have a member of staff available for you to talk to as well. But for the library and archives, that's very much turn up. Most people at the Library and Archives, well, it's a range of topics. It's from family history to more in-depth research around interment or any number of subjects around the history of the Isle of Man.
So apart from maybe a sign on the bottom of something that says what it is, how do you know that what you're looking at is what you think it is?
Well, you're right. You know, objects don't tend to come with their story written on them. That would be great if they did. But they don't. And a programme which, I don't know, you may have seen is Fake or Fortune, or Antiques Roadshow even, they do similar. So they're presented with an object. They can kind of date it, kind of understand what it's made of, but how did it arrive in the ownership of the person who sat there before them? And is that truly a Lowry or not? You know, so you'll notice in those programmes, what they'll do is go to archives, or they'll go to sale catalogues, old sale catalogues, delving around in museums for clues to trace that object's life. Often, in the case of Fake or Fortune, it's an artwork. When you see that, that's an indicator of why collections information is so important. That's what we do. We make sure that that artwork's story is captured. We can't stick it to the back of the canvas. We have to have it in separate deposit files or sale catalogues or letters, people's letters referring to the artwork. So programmes like that I really enjoy from a professional point of view as well, because they point up what goes behind saying and proving the authenticity of, in the example I'm using, of an artwork. And that's information that we hold here about our artworks. So behind the scenes, as part of our collections management process, and obviously we're tasked with managing these collections. We don't just put them on display. We don't just store them. We also actively manage them. So we're managing, you know, the information about where they came from, who owned them, where they were previously displayed, you know, in private houses or whatever. We take very seriously the management of that information, and of course we add to that information in what we do to that object. So if we do a condition report, we're looking at the condition of the item, or we're doing some conservation work, again we retain that information. And you can probably tell that's what gets me very excited about my job. When I see an object now on display in a museum, on display in one of our museums, or an artwork, I'm seeing the object, but for me professionally, I'm also thinking about all those layers of information behind that object that really, really reveal why it's important.
Collections Information Manager Jude Dickon. As we've just heard, the Manx Museum Library and Archives is a useful resource for those researching aspects of the island's history or their own family history. But what do the items retained represent? Wendy Thurkettle is the archivist.
I'd say it's partly the written heritage of the Isle of Man, because we hold an immense assortment of both printed books on the library side, but the archive side is papers, records, written records going back, well, to the 1490s and earlier really, that help tell the history of this island, its people, its culture, its politics. There's also an awful lot which is image-wise, so we have photographs, we have earlier prints before photography, we have posters. So it's not all the written word. There's a lot more besides. And the other thing, I suppose, is that there's an awful lot to do with mapping the island. So maps, plans that show how the land use has changed. The resources keep on going and they keep changing, so we have film and sound archives, and of course we're now in the digital era, and so material is coming in different and new formats.
How do you acquire the material? Where does it come from, essentially?
A lot from private hands. We are the Diocesan Record Office, so we get resources from Manx parishes and the diocese and other churches besides. But a lot of it is from private hands, and that might include business archives when businesses cease trading. It might be when a society or association has finished and people want to deposit their minute books and other resources for safekeeping. It varies day to day. I'm never quite sure what I'm going to be offered.
How do you decide what to take, what to keep and what not to?
You do have to be selective. It goes probably without saying, but we have to assess material on its research potential, on the evidence it contains, how useful that might be and how important that is to keep for accountability. And because we're a museum service, also maybe it might be quite ephemeral but have great exhibition value. So we have content currently in that's entertainment exhibition, and that includes playbills and programmes and bits and pieces that tell the entertainment history of the Isle of Man.
And there are some things there that you wouldn't necessarily think would have survived because they were very much, they were kind of disposable in their day.
Yeah, very much. And sometimes the paper wasn't particularly good quality and it comes damaged, but that potentially adds to its charm and its character. Yes, possibly more by luck than design that the content does survive. A lot of material gets destroyed intentionally or by accident, and we can only keep a selection, so we're not trying to be all-inclusive. But sometimes resources come to us that have got a wow factor. Sometimes they might be really everyday, so people might not think we'd be interested in, for example, diaries telling the everyday routine of people, but they have their own interest as well.
And who uses the library and archives? I mean, who is it accessible to?
It's accessible to everyone. We ask people to just do a simple registration form, but there's no age limit, so young to old. And we have people coming in. It could be school projects, it might be university students doing a dissertation. It could be people from advocates firms doing some conveyancing, using our registered deeds. We've got a wide variety of people, and we have access to the internet through our laptop suite, so people might access the iMuseum or other family history websites using our search room.
And giving the public access to certain things must come with conditions, I suppose, because there must be some things in the archives that are fragile.
There are. It depends on how robust an item is, whether we can produce it in the search room. We will do our best, but sometimes material is just too fragile. It is literally falling to pieces. And we can protect it sometimes using protective sleeves and kind of make sort of interim means to try to improve access. But sometimes things do need conservation before they can be produced. Generally, the older the paper, the better quality. So people might be surprised, but some of the early 18th century papers, for instance, are beautiful. They're handmade, and they do very well compared to modern paper.
What are the most significant items within the archive?
In some ways, we're spoilt for choice. I mean, we have the papers of the Dukes of Atholl, who were one-time owners of the island, and the Earls of Derby. So they're really special resources. It's very tricky because we've got so much and it's so varied. So we've got, for example, a lot of strength in the 18th century I mentioned. We've got merchants' papers, businessmen's papers, correspondence. It's really eclectic, the mix sometimes. For instance, we've got papers to do with individuals who are Manx born but perhaps had their working career off island. So an example is Sir Ralph Stevenson, who was a diplomat and who served in Egypt and Japan, had a really interesting career off island, came back to be an MHK. So he's just one example of some fascinating people whose lives are told by the resources that they've left behind.
Now, you must be getting things all the time, really, brought in, or new books that are published that you want to add to your collection. What do you do with them when you get something? What happens? What's the process once you decide you want to keep something?
Well, we have a librarian, Susie, and she will process the printed matter, be it books and pamphlets, with our assistants, Kim and Sarah. With the archives and with printed, we allot a unique reference number to each item. So what we're trying to do is to record the provenance, so where things have come from. That's important for the integrity, especially with archives, because you're wanting to show that this resource is trustworthy. So there's a lot of processing that goes on, and then the core description, the idea is to put more and more information available to search on iMuseum. So the public can actually check out the material we've got, and then if it's available for research, they fill out request slips in the reading room. They can come in and they can actually look at the item.
Archivist at the Manx Museum Library and Archives, Wendy Thurkettle. And the reading room is open on Wednesdays to Saturdays between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. If you'd like to find out about a particular piece of information, you can contact the team in advance of your visit by telephoning 648 047 or emailing library@mnh.gov.im. While some of the archaeological finds from around the island can be seen in the galleries at the Manx Museum, there are a number of items which aren't on display and are held in the museum stores. Alison Fox is Curator of Archaeology.
We are standing in the archaeology store of the Manx Museum down in the basement where nobody really gets to see, but this is where we hold the national collections of the archaeological artefacts. So we have material that ranges in date from the very earliest human habitation in the Isle of Man, the Mesolithic period, so about 8000 BC, right up until shipwreck material that comes from the 1800s and the 1900s. Lots of different kinds of material, so as you'd imagine from prehistoric period, lots of flint implements, again going right through lots of pottery and lots of Viking treasure as well down here.
So what's the time span for this being collected?
I think items or artefacts of archaeological interest have probably been collected and looked after for hundreds and hundreds of years. The earliest collected artefacts we have in this store probably date from the mid-1800s to the late 1800s, but it was really in the early 1900s that there was a movement on the Isle of Man to really push for a national museum where these artefacts from the Isle of Man could be kept. Previously, some items were kept in private collections on the Isle of Man. Also, some items went off to national museums elsewhere. So, for example, we have got some Manx material in the collections of the British Museum and also National Museums of Scotland and National Museum of Ireland as well. So it's really collecting of archaeological artefacts on the island really started with real enthusiasm, I think really in the early 1900s.
And it's rows and rows of shelves with boxes and boxes and boxes on them. What is actually in the boxes?
I think, without being too grand about it, what's in these boxes is the identity of the Isle of Man, really. It's little pieces of the story of the island from the first period of human habitation, and anything that humans have used or have found or have dropped or have left behind them, left by the wayside, all of that material can be interpreted as archaeological artefacts. So we have, for example, we have quite a lot of flint tools and implements. There was a particular collector, Alan Skillen, in the north of the island. He did a lot of field walking, and we have literally tens of thousands of pieces of flint from his collections that he kindly donated to us. We also have artefacts from Viking burials, so as well as Viking treasure, we also have iron items, so the odd cauldron that was buried with a Viking, swords, knives, spearheads. We also have items from the maritime history of the Isle of Man, so we have shipwreck material which might include parts of the ships themselves but also the contents of ships. We have a lot of water-worn pottery from a particular shipwreck off the south coast of the Isle of Man, which doesn't look much in itself but did enable the wreck to be identified and dated to 1834 as a general cargo ship. And we also have, as well in the maritime collections, remains of the wreck of the HMS Racehorse, which was the wreck that really was the catalyst for Hillary to start pushing for what became the RNLI.
Now, in terms of the way they're stored, is everything in here stable? How do you keep an eye on that sort of thing?
Our conservator keeps an overall eye on the stores in the Manx Museums anyway. Most of the material that we have is fairly robust. Some items of prehistoric iron are particularly vulnerable, particularly fragile, so we try and keep those in a very stable environment. The key thing is really not to have any extremes either end. It shouldn't be too dry or too humid. As long as we can keep something stable, sort of in the middle range, then things are pretty much fine. A lot of the soil over here on the Isle of Man is quite acidic, so that means that a lot of fragile and organic things don't survive anyway, so they don't turn up in archaeological excavations or as chance finds. But we do have some waterlogged wood, for example, and some waterlogged leather that came up from the excavations when the dockyard at the Nautical Museum, where the Peggy was, when that was excavated a few years ago. So we have some material like that that needs a little bit more attention, but generally, as long as everything's kept fairly stable, everything's quite happy. The idea behind the National Collections is that everything is available to study. So we do get researchers coming in from time to time asking us if they can have a look in depth at particular areas of the collection. And that's great for us because we can't do all the research ourselves. So we are, very heavily reliant on other people taking an interest and looking in depth at part of the collections. The fact that all this archaeological material exists means that people can reassess the history of the Isle of Man. They can look again at what we think might have been what the Isle of Man looked like 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago. With scientific techniques of archaeological investigation improving all the time, then we can find out a lot more from one particular type of artefact, or in the case of human remains, for example, then we can find out more about that individual without doing too much damage to the actual remains of that person as well.
You'd have to know what you were looking for if you came in here.
Yes, you would have looked on our fantastic database. We have a Grand Museum database, and in theory, every single artefact should have a location on that database. So if somebody wanted to see a particular piece of pottery from the excavations 30 years ago, then in theory I should be able to go straight to that box. And usually I can. We have some areas of the collections, some of the very earliest collected artefacts where the provenance isn't quite so good, so we know that perhaps we've got a collection of flint that came from the Isle of Man, but we don't know any more detail about it, so they are less well catalogued than the artefacts that have got the full provenance.
So this is a different store.
Yeah, this is the store that is dedicated to the human remains. There have been a lot of questions asked about the ethics behind keeping human remains in museum stores over the past 2 decades, really, in the museum industry. And a few years ago, we thought that it would be appropriate to have a store where we put the human remains and no other type of artefact, just so it's a little bit separate, away from the main collections, and just a little bit more respectful, I guess.
There's been an interesting balance there between carrying out your job in terms of dealing with the material, but also, like you say, treating it with some sort of respect.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I know when I was doing my training many years ago, I worked on a site in Kent that had quite a lot of human remains on, and the attitude was, not particularly the organisation, but the individual diggers, was quite blasé about it, lifting the skeletons and the things. And perhaps it's something as I get older, I'm not sure, but now I think because, my job is essentially to help care for the collections, the Manx National Collections, I feel that the remains need to be treated with a little bit more respect than you would, perhaps a piece of iron that's come from the ground. It's slightly different, I think, when you're talking about a human skeleton or the cremated remains of someone from the Bronze Age.
And what sites have these remains come from?
We have a lot of remains here from Rushen Abbey in particular, from before Manx National Heritage took ownership of the site. There have been excavations done there in the 70s and 80s, and we have quite a lot of remains from there. The condition of the human remains from Rushen Abbey is really, really good, very robust. They're all what we call inhumations, which is basically when somebody is buried whole, so they're not cremated, so it's inhumation as opposed to cremation. So we have the very well preserved skeletal remains, and we are always looking again for new information about these remains. The good thing about having such robust and well preserved remains is that specialists can come in and look at the material to see about the conditions these people lived in, whether they were male, female, child, adult, whether they suffered from any diseases, any stresses that were put on their skeleton, and so we can actually find out a little bit more about these people that we've got in the stores. We also have human remains from the Peel Castle excavations in the 1980s. They are in much worse condition than the Russian Abbey skeletons. It's just really to do with soil conditions, soil acidity. And again, there was a report done on the excavations in Peel Castle, so we know a lot more about the people who are buried there. Probably one of the most famous one is the Pagan Lady of Peel Castle. And recently we've been able to allow access to researcher Dr. Lee Simmons to do some isotope analysis on the remains of the Pagan Lady. Isotope analysis can, amongst other things, tell you where somebody spent the early part of their life, so whether they were local to the Isle of Man or not. And the results suggested that the Pagan Lady wasn't local to the Isle of Man. We also have the skeletal remains from the early Christian cemetery at Balladool, the site just outside Castletown, most famous for the Viking boat burial. But the Viking boat burial was inserted on top of a pre-existing Christian cemetery dating to about AD 500 to 700. So we've got a lot of people from the excavations there that were done in the 1940s. Again, we've done recent isotope analysis. Dr. Katie Hemer did some isotope analysis, and one of the individuals looks as if she may have certainly spent her early years in the Mediterranean or the north coast of Africa. So again, we've got all these collections, and if we can get more people to look at them and to do research, we can start putting the flesh on the bones, if you like.
Over the years, the techniques for actually deciphering what things are must have changed an awful lot.
I think we've got a lot more tools at our disposal now. One of the most important techniques is visual, is actually looking at the human remains, looking at the bones and actually, seeing what signs of anything is there. The scientific techniques now really have improved so much. When I first started out in archaeology, to get a decent, reliable radiocarbon date, for example, you did need more or less a full, long bone to do that. Now you need a gram of material. The techniques are so much better, so much more refined. The results are much better as well. So we've got a lot more tools, but always the first point of call is just to pick up something and look at it, and see what that tells you and take it from there. I think the other advantage over the old-fashioned traditional visual way of looking at things is it doesn't destroy anything either, unless you drop something. It's non-destructive. So whereas you don't need too much of a piece of bone to do radiocarbon dating, you do still need to destroy a little bit. So as much that you can do without destroying any part of the sample is by far and away the best. And on the Isle of Man, there is a licensing system. So, for example, if somebody wanted to do some radiocarbon dating on an archaeological artefact, they have to get a licence from MNH before they do that. So that's a great way for us to be able to monitor and also advise on projects that may want to destroy parts of certainly if it's the national collections.
Curator of Archaeology for Manx National Heritage, Alison Fox. We'll hear more about the national collections held by MNH, including the natural history collections, after the break.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
On today's programme, we're finding out more about the national collections held by Manx National Heritage, which help to preserve aspects of the island's history for future generations. In the first part of the programme, we heard about the items contained within the archaeology stores and the Manx Museum Library and Archives. But another of the collections contains items relating to the natural history of the Isle of Man. Laura McCoy is Curator of Natural History.
We have a really good representation of the natural history of the island. So I think a lot of people think of natural history collections as just stuffed, weird looking animals with strange googly eyes that make people feel uncomfortable. We don't, well, we do have a couple of those actually, but but we actually do have some very good quality taxidermy which looks like it can get up and walk away. But we also have a large entomological collection, a herbarium, a fungi collection, bryophytes, so mosses and lichens, and shells, fossils, minerals. So yeah, basically nests, skins, eggs, you name it. Basically if it's natural, we've got a bit of it. Sometimes more than one bit, sometimes we've got several. What's interesting about natural history collections is each specimen is a snapshot in time. So people would maybe open a drawer in a collection and see 100 blue tit skins. When I talk about skins, so think of a taxidermy specimen, but it hasn't been posed to look like it's alive. It'll just be lying flat, like it's asleep. So you might open a drawer and you'd see a lot of bird skins, all of the same species, and you go, well, why do you have all of those? Well, if you imagine that it's a species which has a niche, so an ecological niche, so choughs occur on cliff faces and they need very short grass land to feed. That's how they feed. That's their niche. You won't find them in a dense forest. That's not where they live. So if you find a chough and you prepare it as a specimen, that's a record of that habitat in that place at that time. And of course, as we can tell, our environment is changing hugely, partly because of us, partly because of other reasons. And so to have a record of how it's changing, all you have to have is that specimen. You'll be able to say, well, I know that was there at that time because that species was there at that time. So having those old collections, so having if you collected a representative of a species every year and you had been collecting them for 200 years, and then all of a sudden you can't collect them in the same place anymore because that habitat doesn't exist, all of a sudden you're proving that a change has happened. And why is it happening? Is it something that you need to look at and monitor or try and save or preserve? Or what if somebody wants to, say, reclaim a habitat? Say a land has been drained for farming many years ago, but it's decided that that land isn't useful or economically viable to farm anymore, so they'd like to recreate what was there before. Well, if you've got a record of all the species that were there, you've got a good idea of where to start. So people think that they're just like weird things for people to look at, but actually it's a record of the earth.
So is it about creating timelines then?
Yeah, definitely. But also you have to have the expertise and the knowledge to know what to collect and when and where and why. So you don't go out and just arbitrarily collect. What you would do is maybe there's something that you want to purposefully monitor or that you think is vulnerable that you want to keep a track of. So it's very concerted, but also as well it is useful. So people do come in and offer me specimens, so things that they may have found. So they'll have found a dead bird in their garden, and sometimes I will keep those specimens because they are useful, and I'll think, oh well, maybe there's not that many of those. Or think of the sparrow. I mean, 10 a penny. Like 100 years ago, people would think, oh, they're a pest, or they get everywhere. They're like locusts. And now sparrows across are becoming really quite, they're not rare exactly, but they are threatened officially. They are threatened as a population. You hardly see any. And the thing is what you get is you get a creep, you get a biological creep of the environment that we see today and that we're used to is not the same as the environment that our grandparents and our great-grandparents see. So, you have to make sure that you keep in people's memory what we have and what we have lost. So we are in the entomology store. We have, if you imagine, there are lots of wooden cabinets with quite slim drawers, and when you open those drawers, they are filled with dozens, if not hundreds, of invertebrates or insects. So we can open a drawer now, and I will show you an example. So this is a part of the Bailey collection, and you can tell here by the way that the insects have been mounted that they're on quite old paper. So this is quite an old collection, and it's very varied. In the drawer that I'm looking at, you've got some chrysomelids, which are like jewel looking beetles. They're iridescent green, vibrant, very, very pretty. You've got some tiger beetles. You've got a big selection here, some devil's coach horse beetles, and they're carnivorous. We've got some cockchafer beetles or maybugs that people often see. They sort of hear them before they see them, and they'll hit your lights when you've got them on at night time, and they're lovely. Probably one of the biggest beetles that many people will see. and also some really, really teeny tiny little beetles, which are sort of the size of a pinhead, which are, just really, really sweet. But again, it's a different species. I think many people see tiny things and, they just brush it off or think, oh, it's a gnat or something. But actually, there are so many tiny different species of animals that people just don't realise are there. It's this whole little microcosm that is really varied. For instance, micromoths, there are hundreds of species of micromoths, and they're tiny little things, and often when you look at them under the microscope, their wings will look like feathers, like they don't have that sheen, glass-like sheen of a wing, an invertebrate or an insect wing. It'll look feather-like, and that's because they're so tiny that the surface tension that wing structure creates in the earth, they kind of swim through the air, because to them it feels thicker because they're tiny. So it's kind of cool. They deal with a whole different mechanics because they're so small, so they experience the earth in a very different way than we do.
And is everything in here, everything in the stores, is it peculiar to the Isle of Man, or maybe not peculiar to the Isle of Man, but specific to the Isle of Man?
Yes, so the majority of the collections that the Manx Museum hold are Manx, and that's because, well, we can't compete with the Natural History Museum in terms of having a worldwide collection, and nor would we want to. We don't need to. What we represent is the Isle of Man, and we do that very well, and we do that better than anywhere else, and that's the same as all regional museums. They all specialise in their region better than anywhere else, and that's the way it should be. Even if you went to the Natural History Museum, which everybody looks at as like, oh, the pinnacle, and they have everything of everything, well, no, they don't. We have more Manx stuff than they do. They do have some Manx things, but yeah, we are the holders of that treasure.
What else have we got in here? We've been looking at some beetles there.
Yeah.
How varied are the natural history collections?
Well, we have everything. So, as I was saying before, we have moths and butterflies. We have lots of moths and butterflies. So days gone by, people did collect a lot of moths and butterflies. Yes, we do have a lot of what we call Lepidoptera, is the group of butterflies and moths. They're very pretty, but again, if they've got good data with them, they are that snapshot in time. So there are things that are less common today than they used to be, and so having a record of that abundance and where they've been found is really useful. So, just because we have maybe a lot of tortoiseshell butterflies, that doesn't matter, because that's a record of what those animals were experiencing at that time. So,
how good was the data that was collected in the past?
Some of it's excellent. We do have specimens that are 100 years old, but really what you want when it was collected and where it was collected and by who. And the more accurate location you can give, so we often refer to things like grid reference numbers, but even just a very good description. So sometimes we'll have, Ballabeg Farm in wherever, and well, that's pretty accurate. You can get super accurate to 10 metre squared or metre squared precision, but even just narrowing it down to a location can be very, very useful. So some of the old collectors were, because actually, even Charles Darwin and people before him, or even people in the 16th century, if they attached good data to that specimen, then it makes it valuable to science. If you don't have data, it's not meaningless, because you can still get things like genetic analysis from it, but a lot of the way that data or information can be used is lost if you don't have the locality and the date that you found it. So yeah, it does make a huge difference. If you took all the labels off our specimens, oh yes, it would be a bad day.
Curator of Natural History, Laura McCoy. While there are a selection of items relating to the island's social history on display at the Manx Museum and other heritage sites around the island, a vast number of objects are not permanently on display. The larger objects are held in a dedicated store, as Assistant Curator for Manx National Heritage Hannah Murphy explains.
We are in our large objects store, so this is where we store a lot of our agricultural equipment, things that couldn't otherwise be stored at the Manx Museum complex. We have a whole range of objects here. Most of them are social history items, so They tell the story of people and their lives, and we do have some archaeological objects as well, which have evidence of human activity.
And it's a big space.
It's huge, and one of the joy of doing tours is seeing people's faces when they walk into the space. I don't think they're quite expecting it to be so big and to see so many objects in the space as well.
And where do the objects come from? I mean, where have you collected them from?
We've collected them over a long period of time. So some of them have come from the Grove Museum. Some of the objects, the carts and agricultural equipment, were stored in outbuildings at the Grove, and we've been able to bring them indoors, which is much better in terms of conservation. Some were in working use at Cregneash, and we had an agricultural expert who came over and told us that the ones being used at Cregneash are actually very rare, and so we were able to bring those inside, and some of our more generic machinery is now used as working collection at Cregneash.
So this is, I suppose, to keep them safe?
It is. It's really important to conserve our objects for the future. We can't fully predict the significance of our collections to future generations, so we need to make sure that we conserve them for as long as possible. And when we acquire objects, we have a duty to care for them forever.
Can we have a look around?
Yes, so I will show you our Renault motor car, it was manufactured in 1908 and registered in 1911, and it is in fact the oldest registered car on the Isle of Man, and it was owned by a Mr. Wilson James Ashburner, and he was a member of the Manx Automobile Club. He was also a great friend of Archibald Knox's, and we know from the Manx newspapers that they used to hold workshops together, arts and crafts workshops, at Wilson James Ashburner's home in Douglas. We acquired this from the Motor Museum, and it wasn't always yellow. It's been a few different colours in its lifetime, but the Motor Museum stripped it back to its original colour and painted it yellow. And we do prioritise the acquisition of working vehicles, and I'm delighted to say that this is in full working order. And in order to keep it in working order, our conservator cranks it every year to keep the engine ticking over.
So it's not just about putting them in a unit somewhere and locking them up, it's about making sure they remain in working order.
That's right. We do have to make a decision as to whether we would freeze an object effectively or keep it in working order, and we prefer to keep things in working order, which keeps the integrity of the original object intact. We also have some cinema seats from the Strand Cinema, obviously in Strand Street. So in the early 90s, when a lot of shops were demolished for the Strand Shopping Centre, such as the Savoy Cafe and Kermode and Bignell, we have the Kermode and Bignell sign over there, we decided to acquire quite a lot of the shop contents because it was the trend in museums at the time to create diorama displays, but now we have a much stricter collecting policy, and we would probably take a photographic record of the contents of a shop and maybe select a few key items rather than take the whole interior as was done then. We have some man traps here which were used at Government House and Castle Rushen in the early 19th century. So they were hidden in the long grass to deter poachers, and they were outlawed in the UK in 1827, but not in the Isle of Man until 1872.
That's quite a big difference.
Yes, it is, yeah.
And they look vicious.
They do really look vicious. They have impact, certainly. So they would have caused serious injury to someone's leg. We have a couple of objects which are associated with the cholera epidemic of 1832 and 1833, and one of them is this statue from the Widow's House in Muckle's Gate in Douglas, which was the earliest recorded street name in Douglas. And this statue was from Widow Squibb's house. Widow Squibb was a victim of the 1833 cholera outbreak, so she left her property to the poor of Douglas, and there were a lot of changes that happened as a result of the cholera outbreak. Authorities realised that they needed to do more to improve sanitation and water provision, and the Douglas House of Industry, which is now the Ellen Vannon Home, opened in 1838 as a result. We also had the formation of the Dorcas Society, which is one of the earliest charities on the Isle of Man. That was formed in 1834. We have the Cholera Cross as well, which is just here, and this marked the site of a mass grave in St George's Churchyard where 120 victims of the cholera outbreak were buried. And you can see where the woods rotted off at the bottom. So this was replaced with another memorial, and we have the original cross here.
So a pretty dark period in the island's history associated with those items then?
Yes, it was a dark period, but there were really important sanitation measures that came out of that, improvements to sanitation and provision for the poor in Douglas. And yeah, I guess it's part of history that you have dark sides as well. So we like to talk about everything.
So basically this room is a huge collection of parts of Manx history.
It is, yeah. It's a huge amalgamation of our Manx history. We collect to provide learning and enjoyment and to foster a sense of Manx identity, to promote Manx culture, and that's what we're all about. So, we invite people to come to the store and to see these things for themselves. As I say, there's only a small percentage of objects on display. Probably over 95% of our objects are in permanent storage. So it's great that people can actually come and see our stores and find out more about their Manx history.
Assistant Curator for Manx National Heritage, Hannah Murphy. And you can find out more about many of the items featured in the collections mentioned on the programme today by visiting iMuseum.im. And you can hear more about the island's history and heritage in the Island Life series Exploring Island Heritage on Tuesday evenings at 5:30. You can also find it on the Manx Radio portal. That's it for this week's programme. We'll be back at the same time next week. But for now, have a very good afternoon.